So thank you again for joining us. As Kiko was saying, this is the second online conference we're doing and the second academic session. This is, in a way, a test. So thank you for being our guinea pigs of research. And if all goes well, we'll aim to do a couple more later this year. And one thing first, hopefully we'll have more women in the next one. We now have 2 of us, and it's 3 papers by men, a commentary by men. I think that could be another, it definitely is another research issue. As we've seen, the output from women has gone down in this pandemic. And while doing this invitation for people, I had a lot of researchers that said that could not attend and participate because of dealing with house and family. I just wanted to address that head front before we're called into a manel, or while most head researchers are men. Then why do we do this? We started the academic session last year because we've been a source of information for think tanks and knowledge, and we've started to build our academic and our research outputs more strongly lately. And we have embarked in several activities to encourage the study of think tanks. We have a working paper series. We first started in 2015 with a series of webinars, and I think, Marcos, you were part of them. Yes. So Marcos has been with us since the beginning, and we are now we have a working paper series. We have the Open Think Tank Directory, which is something that we also want to talk about and you can visit the booth, which is an initiative to collect and make public a lot of information of think tanks all over the world. We now have we publicly now have 2,600 think tanks, but we, after really intense work for over 7 months, we will now be uploading many more, and we'll have around 4,000 organizations. And that's a public database with more than 60 variables on think tanks, from descriptions to their turnover, in some cases, leaders. So that's a rich set of information for anyone that wants to work on them. And now, enough of the introductions. How will it work today? This is an opportunity to present and discuss research on think tanks and evidence-informed policy with fellow academics, but also with think tankers, practitioners, and funders. We found that many academic spaces were very geared just towards academics, and think tanks being a boundary organization with their feet in many different areas. I think it's important that we also have our academic encounters also with others belonging to think tanks, to funders, to comm specialists. So this is a space for academics and think tankers and everyone's interested in this research to come together to discuss, to develop new ideas, and to think about what needs to be researched further. And that's our session later on. And finally, how will this work? We have, this is kind of informal in style. We want people to discuss, engage. Please, if you want to speak, I will have to add you to speak in the group. I will have to add you, so please register, request to enter. If not, the chat is here for everybody to ask questions. And today we have one panel and one presentation and one participatory session. So the first one, we have, it's called Diversity, Inequality and Representation in Think Tanks. We have 2 papers and one commentary. So the papers that we're going to present first is Towards an Epistemic Evaluation of Think Tank Ecosystems, the Case of Epistemic Justice. That's by Andréanne Veillette. She's a student of philosophy, a master's student at the University of Sherbrooke in Canada. And François Claveau, I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that well, associate professor at the University of Sherbrooke and Canada researcher in practical epistemology. And the author of this paper is also Amandine Catala, who could not be with us today. Then we have a paper by Marcos Gonzales, who's a senior researcher at FESP Task and visiting fellow at the University of Bath, and he's doing a paper on diversity and economic inequality and think tanks. And he's also been, the paper's also been authored by Isabel Borja, who could not be with us today. And finally, we have the commentary by Ajoy Datta, who's a research associate at On Think Tanks. And what we'll do is we have 15 minutes for each presentation. Then we have 10 minutes commentary. And then we'll have a Q&A. I'm going to start letting people in. If you're in and you're not presenting, please mute your microphones. And that's it. I'll give the floor first to François and Andréanne. And thank you for being here, and thank you for being here, Marcos, as well. And Ajoy, our commenter, has just accessed. Thank you.
All right. So I'll just try to get my slides up, and Andréanne will start.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Okay, let's see how that works. That should be that one. Not sure. Wait a minute, because I just see names. So just okay. That will work in a second. Here we go. All right, you see my slides now? And if I go like that, everyone sees. Can I have someone tell me that it works?
Yes, it works.
Yes, it works.
You can click on the image if you want to make it bigger. For
on my side or on your yeah, okay, because on my side it's huge.
Yeah. If you click on it, you can make it bigger.
All right. So, and I don't see Andréanne, which is a bit sad for me. Okay, now I see her. You. Okay. All right. So, thank you for
working. Okay. So what we're going to present this morning is actually based on a chapter we've written for a collective on think tanks, and it's entitled Toward an Epistemic Evaluation of Think Tank Ecosystems, the Case of Epistemic Justice. As Andrea said, it's written by me, François Claveau, and our colleague Amandine Catala, who couldn't be here this morning. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Okay, so this chapter that we're going to present is part of a larger project in which we suggest a move to an epistemic evaluation of the think tank ecosystem. So here there are two terms that need more explaining in what I've just said. The first being epistemic evaluation. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's important to note that we're three philosophers working in epistemology, which is the philosophy of knowledge. So we're interested in think tanks as knowledge producers. So the idea here is that think tanks aren't just ideological machines, they also produce knowledge which is relevant to public policy. So the idea here is to evaluate the knowledge, the research that comes out of think tanks to see how reliable it is, to see how we can use it in public policy. So that's the first part. The second part is taking think tanks, instead of taking them at the organizational level, where we evaluate think tanks as separate and evaluate their own properties and how those properties let them perform well or less well, we're going to push towards an evaluation that's ecosystemic. So the idea here is a bit what Andrea was saying in her opening remarks, which is that think tanks have a foot in many worlds, and the space of think tanks is interstitial. So this is heavily inspired by Thomas Medved's work. So the idea is that think tanks have to deal with actors from the political field, from the economic field, from the media field, and from academia. So because they have to go and get resources in all of these different fields, the idea is that if we want to evaluate their level of epistemic performance, we have to take them with all these different actors and take into account all the different interactions. Take it away, François. Oh, I can't hear you.
It's like juggling with many screens. You hear me now, right?
Yeah.
I'll leave the microphone on. I just wanted to leave all the room for you. But okay, I'm back here. So that's a huge project. We started it a year ago, and it will last at least 5 to 6 years. So in this huge project, we selected like a little chunk that we present today based on a specific paper. And this chunk is not looking at epistemic performance, so the knowledge production in general, but at one idea, which is epistemic injustice or justice. And I'll just explain that to you now. So first note that this notion had a big push by the publication of Miranda Fricker's book in 2007 called Epistemic Injustice. And a definition of it is that, so it's a specific type of injustice. It's a wrong done to individuals specifically in their capacity as knowers. And Andréanne and I thought the best way for you to grasp this idea rapidly was to just give you an example. So I'll use like First Nations in Canada. We're from Canada, by the way. So I'll use that as an example to help you see what specific type of injustice it is. So note first that, First Nations in Canada have suffered historically like many types of injustices. They've been, they like lands rights have been, they lost their land rights. They had problems with their rights to security, to their rights to socioeconomic opportunity, and so forth. So many types of injustices. And epistemic injustice is one type of injustice that they suffered in two ways. So the first one is that their thoughts, their opinions, their knowledge has been easily dismissed by kind of settlers' culture. So if they testify, if they've been testifying to general public or policymakers, often they've been just their talk has been left aside. So here they suffered an undue deficit of credibility. So that's the first part of the epistemic injustice. And the second part is that standard mainstream resources to make sense nowadays, understand the social experiences they were more attuned to the settlers' culture, so the way of life of the settlers' culture, which implies that the experiences of First Nation people were not adequately understood by settlers' culture, but also First Nation people had trouble interpreting their own experiences in the context of the settler society. So in these two ways, so the first one being that they had a hard time being heard, and the second way they had a hard time making sense in the public realm of their own experience. In these two ways, they suffered epistemic injustice. And now our research question for this part of our work is, well, are think tank ecosystems contributing to get us closer to epistemic justice? And how could they do so? How could the think tank ecosystem be a contributor to epistemic justice? And in this paper, what we did is simply to extract from the existing literature the characteristics of ecosystems that can be conducive or detrimental to epistemic justice. So there's a literature on think tanks, and people have been pointing out that some characteristics have these and these effects or implications, and we basically construct a simple grid to see whether these characteristics are detrimental or conducive to epistemic justice. And that's what Andréanne will present in the next slide.
Okay, yeah, so thank you, François. Here, what we have is a grid where I'm going to present some factors that are from the ecosystem that can perpetuate epistemic injustice or counter epistemic injustice. Of course, here we have a few factors. There are more probably. This is just a few examples that we concentrated on in the paper. So we've decided to separate the grid in two kind of categories, the first being the message and the second being the transmission. So epistemic injustice can occur at either of these levels, or it can be inhibited at either of these levels. What we mean by message is what the think tank itself is working on, the message it wants to circulate. So the idea is really here, there are no intermediaries, it's really the think tank's message itself. when we think about transmission, what we're saying is how the message is taken up. So is it taken up by the media, by academics, by policymakers? How is it taken up, and what type of ecosystemic factors influence if the transmission itself perpetuates epistemic injustice or counters it? So I'm going to start with the message and with what can perpetuate epistemic injustice in the ecosystem. So the first one is skewed funding sources. So as we said, think tanks have to reach into different fields to gain capital or resources that they need. That includes funding. And here, what we see is that there can be homogenous funding sources, meaning that there is one type of interest which is represented by the funding class, if you will. So here, inspired by works such as Dresner, we can say that if there is interests that are limited, which are represented within the group of funders, which think tanks can then go and get resources from, maybe the message will be skewed to represent the interests from those limited funders. Another factor that can perpetuate epistemic injustice is a staff that's low in diversity. So when I say low in diversity, it can be low diversity in gender, in ethnicity. It can also be low diversity in expertise. And this will constrict the interests that, or the questions, the research questions, which are deemed interesting within the think tank. So if we have low diversity in one think tank or low diversity in many think tanks, then we could have a very limited message that's circulating. So that's for some factors that can perpetuate epistemic injustice when it comes to the message. Now, there are some factors that can counter epistemic injustice, and one of them is also related to funding. So the idea is that there are different methods of funding and that there can be something like open funding. Here I'm thinking about the think tank initiative, which gave funding to different think tanks in different countries, specifically to diversify voices in public policy. So here it's an effort to diversify. There's funding with, okay, I was going to say no strings. It's not completely free of all constraints, but it's more open and it seeks to diversify voices. So it doesn't have the same effect. Then another factor that we wanted to touch upon is how think tanks can take up messages from marginalized groups, and they can frame it in expert speak. So they can transform a message that wouldn't be digested in certain spheres and take it up and then transform it in expert speak so that it circulates within other spheres. Here I'm thinking maybe an example would be the Yellowhead Institute, which in Canada is a link between First Nations and policymakers. So they're a link doing research on questions of interest to First Nations. So these are a few examples of factors that can have an incidence on the message. And so I'm going to move on to transmission. So what can perpetuate epistemic injustice in when the message is taken up? So the first one is pretty self-explanatory: direct censorship. When there's censorship, voices are unjustly silenced. So a think tank could emit a message, but if there's direct censorship, then the message would never leave the think tank, or the message could eventually not even be produced because of that censorship. Then there's another factor which we called corporate bias, which is mainly related to the media, where and linked to an idea of catering to the dominant class or the dominant class's interests. So the media has certain constraints on its functioning, such as getting revenue from advertisements and from other sources, and it can be not very enticing to talk about something that could be very controversial, which is linked to marginalized groups, and therefore lose revenue from some advertisers, or place themselves in a position where they have to fight against the status quo. So they could take up less messages from certain think tanks, which have a message that's linked to marginalized groups. And then we have factors in the transmission that can counter epistemic injustice. So there's the progressive bias of the media. And this is kind of funny to state this way, because usually when we talk about journalism and we talk about bias, it's not seen as a good thing. But here, if there's an unbalance between conservative voices and progressive voices, let's say there's more conservative voices, more conservative messages. If the transmission, so let's say the media, has a progressive bias, we can regain some form of balance that way. So here it would be the liberal bias that's documented in the States for journalism. If we stick with journalism, there's also the journalistic norm of balance, which can be something that counters epistemic injustice. This is something we're more used to when we think about journalism. The idea is that journalists have to confront two different points of views when they're talking about a controversial subject. So here, a think tank could fill a certain niche for a certain point of view, which is maybe more marginalized or more liberal than another point of view, let's say. And this, so once these messages are transmitted, either in a way that perpetuates epistemic injustice or counters it, these are messages that will be taken up by policymakers and such because they follow these canals.
All right. So like the main message of our little typology is, in fact, that whether your think tank ecosystems contribute to epistemic justice or not really depends on the specifics of these ecosystems. So depending on the characteristics that are instantiated in these ecosystems, they could be, in fact, vectors of epistemic justice, or they could not be. So the next step, and that's what we've been doing in the last couple of months for Canada, is to look empirically which characteristics are instantiated by regional ecosystems. So we did it for Canada, and the hope is to do it for other countries or other regions in the world. So in the Q&A, if you want to discuss, for instance, what are our first results for Canada, I would be really happy to do that with you. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francois and Andréanne. This was really interesting, and I would love to hear about the first evaluation of the regional ecosystems. It sounds like a really interesting work, and I'll ask more questions after Marcos has spoken later on. But thank you. This is really interesting, and it gives a lot of food for thought and a lot of avenues forward as well. So, Marcos, please.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I'll try to share screen as well. 1 second. How do you do this?
So you get.
Sorry.
So there's like. So you see the button, the button at the bottom with like a screen, right? So if you click on that, you get like a drop-down list.
It's not working on
that's the hard part, because you have to figure out which one of this these entries on the list is the screen you want to share. But if you don't have the drop-down list, then that's an issue.
Okay. Yeah, it's not appearing for some reason. It's not appearing. Anyway, it's not that important, actually, I don't think. I mean, there was a couple of graphs there, but I think I can do it without. I'm very sorry, but for some reason the drop-down list... Oh, wait. Now it did, apparently. 1 second. Anyway, whilst I try to do this, I guess I will introduce myself. So I've been working with think tanks for a while, and I think I'm sort of half academic, half policy researcher at this stage of my career. And I've been working for a while on a project on views of inequality of high-income earners. Okay, in particular in 4 European countries, the top 10% of income earners and their attitudes towards inequality, redistribution, and welfare. Okay. The justification for that project was basically that according to a lot of work that had been done before on surveys. Oh, you have it. Brilliant. Thank you, Andrea. Yeah. So could you please go to the second slide? Andrea, could you please go to the second slide? Okay, thank you. According to Martin Gillens, the top 10% of income earners, who he calls key affluent, have several differences with the rest of the population, particularly in relation to that. I mean, not only obviously that they earn more money, but they have different characteristics. They're more likely to be professionals, obviously. They're more likely to have a university degree. They're also more likely to feel, when asked, that they have a voice in how the country is run, and more likely to feel trust in institutions such as the legal system or the political system. Okay, they're also more likely to have different views in relation to policy. Okay, such as they're more likely to hold liberal views in relation to issues like same-sex marriage or abortion rights. They're also less likely to oppose immigration. They're also more likely to support an internationalist policy agenda. And crucially, for the project that I was just working on, are probably less likely than the rest to favor redistribution or tax and spend policies. Okay. Also, crucially as well, this population, their preference is more likely than the populations that other segments of the population to actually influence policy, or through whatever mechanism, the policy preferences are more likely to coincide with actual policy outcomes. Okay. Partly, arguably, is because this population is more likely to vote as well. Okay. But also because arguably the top higher echelons of the worlds of media, politics, academia, etc., are populated by people who are high income earners. Okay. Can you please go to the next slide? Andrea, can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay, that would be probably a bit too small to see, but this is just further data to showcase this point. Okay, in particular, the first one is probably a bit too small to see, but what it shows is the massive difference between the percentages of people who belong to different parts of the income distribution and the type of occupations that they have. Crucially, focus on the first. The first one is a bit too small. It's the armed forces. You can't really see, but the second and third, the blue bar represents the percentage of people in that occupational category that belong as a part of the whole population, and the red one as part of the high income earners. Okay, so that's the top 10%. Sorry, Andrea. Yeah, that one. Thank you. So the top 10% is more likely to have managers and professionals, obviously, and it's likely to have many of the other trades, actually a majority of the population, that basically employ a majority of the population. Okay, could you please scroll down now? Sorry about this, Andrea. Okay. Could you please scroll down? Thank you. That graph, basically, these are two sources. That's the European Social Survey. Anyway, I think it's a bit too complicated. I'll just go very quickly over what these graphs say, and then I'll move forward. Okay. So this is basically attitudes towards redistribution and towards views of meritocracy. Okay. And especially what you see in that graph is that there's a significant difference between the percentage of the population that agrees with this statement. Large differences in income are acceptable to reward talents and effort depending on where they are in the income distribution. Okay, that's very briefly what it means. Could you please go to the next slide now? Thank you. Yes. So what this shows, again, showing that so as a majority, these are just differences and proxies to see the degree of inequality in terms of occupation. Okay, so probably most think tankers will be considered professionals or associate professionals, and as you see there, especially in the second one, where you see that big red bar, that basically means that over 80% in the UK, and that's just one example, but in other countries it's pretty similar. Over 80% of the people who are professionals are part of the top 10% of income distribution and have higher education degrees. Okay, all of which are associated with particular policy preferences, at least at an aggregate level. Okay, this is all just to give a bit of background to how different the population that are professionals tends to be compared to the rest. Okay, whether that's good or bad is difficult to tell, and probably all of us, to some degree or other, regardless of the variation in terms of income that we have, is probably going to be more likely to belong to this kind of population, and hence also to be more likely to be employed by think tanks. Okay, because obviously there's a big barrier of entry to think tanks, which is actually very often the fact that people need a degree. Okay. A degree mostly in different careers, and we wanted to see that actually as part of the project, to basically to be able to be employed by think tanks. Okay, Andrea, could you move to the next one, please? Okay, so why study economic inequality in think tanks then? As previous research has shown, then on think tanks has shown, not only are inequalities of access unfair in relation to inclusion and social mobility, I'm thinking especially of previous research that has been done on gender, okay? But they also have an impact on the kind of ideas that get a hearing in politics, okay? In particular, inequalities of access to think tanks then are important because social homogeneity risks engendering ideational homogeneity as well, okay? From my experience, think tank leaders come from a similar social background. This will not only have effects on who is most visible, but also the kind of ideas, preoccupations that get a hearing. Okay. Furthermore, as the literally revolving door has shown, there's definitely a correlation between having worked for think tanks and occupation in other important fields of society, such as the media, public service, politics, etc. Okay. So that's, broadly speaking, the preoccupations of this project and this future working paper that I'm working with on think tanks. Okay. Now, this is all work in progress. At the moment, we're wrapping up the data gathering stage. But basically, what we wanted to do with Isabel was basically to look at the questions: are there important barriers of access to the think tank world that derive from economic inequality? And if so, what effects does this have on the type of work that think tanks produce? Okay, or in other words, what is the makeup of think tanks in terms of social provenance, as much as we can actually assess it from publicly available sources, and whether that has an effect on the kind of ideas that get a hearing. Okay, for that we picked 8 countries, and we picked basically, we're building a database with the senior staff of 10 think tanks, so 80 think tanks in total, in each of these countries, crossing Europe, Latin America, plus Canada. Okay, we're being helped with that with the we're using the on think tank resources, obviously, and we're also trying to find. A lot of the research that we've been doing actually has been desk research, looking at the data that is out there on the individuals concerned. Okay, so basically looking at the senior staff, looking at where they come from, social provenance, degree of education, etc., to see whether there are important barriers of access. Okay, could you please move to the next one, Andrea? Okay, so the main proxies are educational and occupational sector. But again, as this is a work in progress, I'd very much like to hear from you in relation to how to look at inequality for 2 reasons. And actually, that's one thing that I wanted to draw attention to, is that inequality, at least observable inequality, has at the very least 2 dimensions when you look into this sort of thing. The first one is professional academic resources that an individual might draw upon, which are more likely to be accessible by us. Okay, so that's obviously the university they attended to. If it's in the UK, for example, University of Oxford, University of Cambridge are likely to say something about the individuals and the nerves that they have. Also, the professional background, the parcours that they have before, is also likely to tell you a bit about the ideational background of the people involved. But also, there are other types of inequality that are more or less visible, and that require a more subtle degree of sort of sensibility to them. Okay, and some of them also need a bit of familiarity with the background of the country, which we'll see in the next slide in relation to Chile, where I come from. Okay, which includes things like ethnicity, to be sure, but also things like the school they attended, even the surnames in some countries that they have. Okay, and gender. I haven't been touching gender because it sort of cuts across, but gender obviously is it's important too. Okay, so in terms of the methodology, we draw a list of 10 think tanks, as I said, from across the political spectrum in each country, from the OTT think tank directory, vetted by experts from each of these countries. So in all the countries that I don't really have direct knowledge, I have, through my contacts, thankfully, one of the criteria to select in these countries is actually to know someone who could help me with vetting which think tanks to select. I'm trying to make it as representative as possible. Okay, and draft a database with previous employment, educational qualifications, discipline, university, highest degree. Unfortunately, in the best of all possible worlds, I would like to see data on primary and secondary education, but that's not always available. Okay, and some methodological issues that we've been facing thus far is that there are limitations to available online sources. For instance, in the case of Peru, not all think tanks have updated staff profiles, and a lot of the staff doesn't have LinkedIn profiles either. Okay, that varies from country to country. In some of them, there's a lot of resources. Even if you Google the person, it's very easy to find. Okay, by the way, we're just using available public data. We're not doing anything more intrusive than that. Okay, and as I said before, also that some contextual knowledge is sometimes required. Okay, surnames, reputation of education institutions, etc. Okay, Andrea, can you please move to the next one? Okay, and some preliminary results. I just wanted to mention briefly that being that I'm Chilean, the first country that I wanted to look into was Chile. And some of the things that immediately come to mind when you look at the profiles of the people that we found in the 10 most representative think tanks that we selected in Chile from across the political spectrum and with different sort of profiles, is that they tend to have different educational, disciplinary, and professional profiles that are linked with different networks as well. This doesn't mean that one political sector is more elitist than others, but merely that they draw from different elites, okay? So for example, in Chile, you have, like in other Latin American countries, I think, you have two big prestigious universities, one that is mostly linked to the public sector, and another one linked to the Catholic Church. The one linked to the Catholic Church tends to be more associated with the right, with economics, and with the sort of conservative sphere. And the left is more linked with professionals in public policy, sociology, etc., and with Universidad de Chile, which is a public university. Okay, so that's a first thing to see. There are other clear gender, age, and class inequalities within think tanks. Okay, we didn't really look at describing the other parts of a think tank beyond the senior staff, because that would be a different kind of work. But what you see definitely when you see the list, you could see definitely that in a few think tanks in Chile, when you see that type of stuff that you're looking into. For instance, there's a definite gender inequality at the level of administrative staff, but also class inequality and administrative staff as well. Gender and class really cut across that distinction, that particular one. And also in terms of the junior research staff, so generally they are, especially, and that's something that I want to mention later, the importance of degrees overseas. So for instance, degrees that were postgrad degrees, especially that were received in Europe or the United States or North America in general. Those it really varies the generation that you're looking into, because if you're looking at all the more senior stuff, they got this degree in a period in which in Chile it was way more difficult and more rare to find people with these degrees. Okay, and hence, and that's something that is very difficult to operationalize. But as a Chilean, I know that certain surnames, for instance, are a marker of social class, and you tend to find these sort of surnames in those kind of senior positions. Okay. So as I said there, education overseas a crucial asset, and at least 2 generations of policy experts can be distinguished in this respect. An older, more elite generation and a younger generation with greater access to scholarships and credit. In terms of professions, politics, consultancy, the third sector, and academia dominate, as one would expect. Okay, we're in the middle of the analysis bit of the research, so actually this is the moment in which we would really like to get feedback from you. If you think that there are some flagrant issues that we need to address, very happy to listen to any critiques or any ideas you may have or any thoughts in general.
Marcos,
Thank you.
That was really interesting. I have some questions, but I'll give the floor first to Ajoy Datta, who will give the commentary on both. I know we're running a little bit late. We have a little leeway at the end, so I'm gonna give Ajoy and the Q&A enough time, and I'm gonna shorten the final session. So just so everybody is aware. So please, Ajoy, it'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks, Andrea. So I'm just going to provide comment on the paper on assessing epistemic justice by Andréanne and François, because of timing. I didn't receive the latter paper until last night. So let me just say, really interesting paper. Thank you, Andréanne and François. Very timely. Thank you. So I've got about sort of 7 points, I think, which connect with various parts of your paper. So I think the first one's around sort of the framework. I was thinking another way to conceptualize sort of a think tank ecosystem could be to draw on, I don't know if you know Paul Kearney, his work on the politics of evidence-based policymaking. I think he's a professor at the University of Stirling in Scotland. And he describes a number of factors which influence policy and which probably influence in some way what think tanks produce and how they go about doing their work. So the factors include like actors or stakeholders, their power, their influence, their interests. Then he talks about institutions or rules of the game. So these are the rules, norms, practices that influence individual and collective behavior. You've then got the context, conditions that policymakers take into account when they're assessing problems and finding ways to address them. Things like geography, demography, economy, technological changes, for example. Policy networks, so relationships between actors who are responsible for policy decisions. Ideas, how they're shared within groups, within organizations, networks, etc. And then, of course, events, critical junctures. So these can be routine, like elections, or unanticipated, obviously, like the pandemic that we're involved at the moment. And I suppose on those sort of critical junctures, we can see how COVID globally, Black Lives Matters in the US and the UK, they've really put a spotlight on issues such as, the role of the state, the role of healthcare, the way in which we conduct our politics, gender inequality, racial discrimination, which I guess will have implications on what think tanks do, how they carve out their research agendas over the next 3 to 6 months, even a year and beyond, and how they go about doing that, how they go about doing their research. So that's on the framework. I was really interested by your discussion on funders, and they clearly play a massive role in shaping the nature of the ecosystem, especially in furthering and protecting certain interests. Yeah, I was thinking how funders, they can work in many ways. They can help to launch new think tanks. They can, they might be able to launch think tanks which represent specific groups, perhaps. Funders, they can use their power to influence think tanks. So current grantees, perhaps, they might sort of influence them to change their agenda. And yeah, I was thinking that they could obviously change who they give money to, so changing their grantees. And I was thinking about sort of the counter climate change movement in the US, and there's evidence that we came across about how, like, between 2003 and 2010, conservative foundations in the US, they funded something like 90 or so different organizations which produced a whole barrage of evidence to counter the mainstream evidence on climate change, to the tune of like $900 million, I think, over 7 years. So, massive influence, which has probably slowed down climate change, slowed down the actions needed to actually avert climate change. One of the important factors you mentioned to address bias within the ecosystem and within the think tank itself is high levels of diversity. or embracing more diverse staff. And I was thinking this on its own isn't necessarily going to help. You need other factors to come into play. So, for example, you might have someone from a minority group, but they've been recruited because they act and think like someone from the dominant group. So not much will change. And even if that person does present, the perspectives they have and that of their group, within their think tank to influence what they do as a group, as an organization, that's not an easy task. It's not just a case of someone from a minority sort of convincing colleagues and, obviously senior colleagues with an argument. It's not a technical thing. It's a political exercise. And, this often provokes very strong feelings in other people, because there's interests at play, there's vested interests and obviously difference in identity, whether it's race, age, class, gender, all these will play out. And, it can be a very tricky, risky business, speaking one's truth, and as I said, it could lead to fallout. It could be more marginalization, which kind of reflects obviously what's happening at a societal level. It could mean being scapegoated. There's that. And then, of course, recruitment of people from minority groups is going to be difficult. So if you are trying to recruit someone from a group which has been historically and systematically discriminated in all sectors of society, they won't necessarily be a sort of a pool of people from that group who have qualifications you're looking for. So the question is, are you going to recruit them based on performance? There's a question of affirmative action. There's a question of quotas, and obviously that can breed a lot of resentment amongst the dominant group. And you see this in South Africa along racial lines. You see that around caste in India. And then, people will say, as the current debate is saying, well, what about us? What about us? Everyone in that larger group will be sort of wanting to be attended to in some way. There's sort of a part of the research which sort of resonates with some research that Andrea and I have done on sort of the connections between think tanks and activists or social movements more broadly. And I was thinking that, we saw how one of the reasons that think tanks partner and engage and work with social movements is to really understand the lived realities of people from, different parts of society. And they can include marginalized groups. We found that think tanks and social movements, they have a variety of different relationships. So you have groups of experts working informally with groups of activists. You've got activists who might represent, marginalized groups sitting on a think tank's board. And you could have the think tank or experts being part of a broader movement, including lots of other organizations as well. And there are many other sort of arrangements which we came across. Something you said about sort of not being taken seriously because of your association with a marginalized group and their interests, that kind of resonated a little bit with what we found in that same paper. So we found that in some cases, some think tanks who worked with social movements, they were a little bit sort of, reluctant to be seen to be too close to them because it might affect the way they're perceived by the dominant group, that they might be getting too cozy. It might be affecting their independence, their objectivity, their reputation might be tainted. So, there's sort of clearly challenges to be too closely associated with a particular group. I was thinking of, there's quite a lot of work out there looking at the difficulties that experts have in engaging marginalized groups, but also vice versa, difficulties that marginalized groups have in engaging with experts. Obviously issues of power, it's because they are marginalized. By definition, they're hard to find, they're hard to recruit, to focus group discussions or workshops. Your methods, if they involve writing and reading and speaking, they might exclude, thinking about language, obviously, people who if you're conducting things in English and, English is their second or third or fourth language, then they might be intimidated. They might have low literacy skills, for example, if you're asking them to fill in a survey or read some materials before a meeting. So yeah, it's important to think about how your methods, your tools, how they can be made appropriate to facilitate participation. There's something around control over the process as well. You need to give away control somehow. You need to give away some of that control to the participants. You might have to provide. You might need training yourself as an expert to know how to engage people from different groups. You might need to provide logistical support, transport to meetings, financial incentives, allowances to compensate for, time lost at work, looking after children, whatever. You might need to sort of really effectively market, your focus group discussions so that people, you can get the right people to the groups, to the meetings. So, trust is really important as well. You can't just rock up and say, come to my meeting, they'll have all sorts of suspicions about what your intentions are. How are you going to use their information for what purpose? So, relationships are at the core of, development processes generally, and certainly central to this. And it's expensive as well. So these things don't come cheap, engaging people from marginalized groups. Then the final point is to do with something which Cameron Naylon, I don't know if you've heard of him, he presented at the last OTT conference, or the one that was in person last year. And I was thinking, what happens to your framework when you acknowledge that a lot of think tanks in so-called developing or emerging economies engage more intensively, not with their own ecosystem, but with those of rich countries around the North Atlantic. That's where their funding comes from. That's where the academic journals are. That's where they go to study. So what happens to your framework? Just a big question there, I suppose. And that concludes my points. So thank you. A great paper.
Thank you.
Andrea, do you want to go to Q&A, and what's the...
Yes, sorry, I was with my microphone off. So thank you very much, Ajoy, for the commentary. I think there's very interesting issues raised, and there's already been some questions on the Q&A. If I'm gonna let people in now, so if you wanna have if you want to be represented more, ask to join so you can have a voice. I had a couple of questions, so I'm going to use my privilege as facilitator to ask to make some interesting points. I like the connection of all the different presentations and the commentary by Ajoy a lot. I really like the point made by Ajoy about thinking like someone from a dominant group, and I think that links with what Marco was saying of being educated overseas. And even though if you come from a different background, the system kind of turns you into this format of thinking. So that's an issue to discuss. And how that relates to the voices and the epistemic justice, I think that's also very important. And we have questions on the Q&A from Hans, who says that he is, I don't know if you can see them, but I'm going to read them out loud, and then I'm going to give the floor to everyone else. So for Hans, it says, what is a substantial point? If diversity means people with a lot of difference, but at the same time opinion, that doesn't push us forward either. So how to deal with that, or do you see that as an issue? Dinian Road asks if there are any examples of organizations doing this well. Well, meaning that having representing a diverse set of people. And yes, Emilia will be having the names of the paper. I'm going to give the floor to everybody else. If you have any questions, please go ahead. And you can start with a question by Hans if anyone's interested.
So now we basically jump in, right? So
yes, just jump in. But I would like to. I think this point by Hans is really interesting to discuss. If diversity means people with a lot of difference, how is that an issue? How do we push forward? So, if anyone wants to jump on that,
yeah. And did it connect Marco's work with? Leandro?
Sorry, going
Go ahead,
François.
Joy.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Joy, because I couldn't see the faces, so I didn't know who was speaking.
Okay. Yeah, and what comes to mind for me is sort of creation of safe spaces within these organizations. Obviously not that safe, or else no one will take a risk. So it's about creating. I think it's about listening. I think certain qualities sort of within individuals and between people within organizations to really enable people to bring forward their perspective, to listen, and avoiding sort of negative consequences, punishments. I mean, how do you bring that about when that might not be present initially? Well, I suppose boards might have to bring in senior managers, who are willing to shake things up a little bit, So that's what comes to mind initially, anyway.
Yeah, and I'd add that obviously we're all worried about something like postcard diversity, right? Just having the picture of I'm doing work on central banks, and you often have that now. Like you have the woman and you're thinking, yeah, that's just for the picture. Yet, I mean yet like at more like a correlational level, or even like more a probabilistic level, kind of that diversity in many different, so really like ethnic and gender and socioeconomic diversity tend to diversify ideas. So it's like there's kind of a probabilistic connection. Obviously, there are clear cases where it's more like postcard diversity. So I would say, like, as a first stake, the first move is to increase diversity, and then we can worry more about kind of the specifics of how to make this diversity indeed produce what we care about, which is kind of diversifying research questions and methods and concerns of think tanks. So that would be how I would take I would think about the process.
Maybe. Oh, go ahead, Marcos.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, I was just thinking that perhaps so something that is very difficult when it comes to diversity in general, and in institutions that attempt to position themselves as experts, as providers and purveyors of expertise, of expert knowledge, is that you need a certain degree of elitism in general, or at least a semblance of elite, or access to an elite type of knowledge, or at least, at the very least, a modicum of expertise. Expertise meaning, I mean, there's very many definitions of expertise, but one that I really like is basically a person who you can follow their advice without being seen as being responsible by following their advice. Okay, and that obviously depends on the context, and it's a social relationship rather than necessarily a link with the world out there, because the world obviously is multifaceted and it has very many different dimensions. Okay, and in general, the main barrier to expertise and the big shortcut and shorthand to expertise is obviously academic degrees. And I mean, one of the main issues obviously is whether, to what extent, and we have a lot of debates these days, especially in the English world, the separation between sort of metropolitan, well-educated elites and the rest. Okay, I don't want to go into that, but basically, I was thinking that it depends. So when you talk about inclusivity, it probably depends on what level of expertise you're talking about. In general, you would find that a lot of think tanks will include like marginalized groups as part of the research process, but a very different sort of thing that you could try to do, and I don't know to what extent it's possible, is to involve them as experts, as people you can heed and you can actually pay attention to at a sort of with a certain degree of epistemic power, without the barrier of academic degrees. I don't know to what extent that is possible. I know, but I don't really know the example very well, that for us, and there are other organizations in Switzerland in particular, but Switzerland is obviously a special case study given its long tradition of local democracy, that try to institute what they call citizen think tanks. Maybe that would be something to look into.
Right. So we have several comments from Leandro. We have another comment from Hans. I'm gonna read the one from Hans right now because it's the last one, and then Leandro has made a lot of comments and then has unfortunately had to leave. Hans said that why do you cage this 3 times over? It's right. So it's a rare skill to be to write a good policy paper. And Hans, do you want to come in line to explain this further? I think this could be an interesting discussion. And in the meantime, I'm gonna read over the Leandro's question. So, Leandro was saying that among the factors of epistemic justice that you identified, Andréanne and François, he said that there's some more external and some more internal. And he was thinking with the idea of more external and more internal factors can help show that think tanks and organizations themselves can also counterbalance injustice, and not everything depends on the context. So what about this balance between internal and external? So what have you thought about that? Have you?
Yeah, so maybe I can start. So epistemic injustice is something that's systemic. So it's going to occur at many different levels. So inside the think tank and outside the think tank with the different other organizations with which the think tank has to interact. So the idea is that it's the same type of power dynamics that are going to be found in different magnitudes, if you will, so inside the think tank and outside the think tank. So we focused on the ecosystemic factors without going too much inside of individual think tanks. But of course, if there is epistemic injustice that occurs inside the think tank, then it's probably going to tend to the message and then the interactions with other organizations. So it would be interesting to maybe separate them, at least just to evaluate what's going on inside the think tanks and then move on to the ecosystemic level, because maybe evaluating both at the same time, we would mix up which factors are which and what they influence. So that could be a good idea to categorize it that way.
You had something as well, Marcos or François? I saw you nodding.
Well, yeah, I'll add something to Andréanne's point, which is that so it kind of depends a bit on our main kind of intellectual interests. So we're really interested in the ecosystem and thinking about like what kind of incentives and norms could there be in the society, let's say, that would favor epistemic justice? So, for instance, the funding is a clear case, right? As everyone realizes, if you have big, massive funding for diversity, then it will incentivize think tanks to do X and Y and Z. It might not work, right? But still, it pushes in the right direction. Then there's the other issue that, Andréanne and I, we haven't been working on that, but really, like, given the leeway that individual think tanks have, like the degree of autonomy and their choices they have, what are the most effective policy, changes or whatever, institutional decisions that they can make to foster epistemic justice. So that's kind of a bit outside of our project, and then that would be kind of I can think about kind of research methodology to do that, but that would be something different, right? So that's not what we're doing now. We're mostly looking at funding, which is a big one, and then thinking about the output of think tanks and how it's transmitted in the rest of society. So media plays a big part, and these are the types of things that we're looking into.
Yes, I think that this also gives way to new research ideas. So whatever we're thinking of on that sense that can expand this, we can look into later. So yes, I think looking at it internally, that's an approach that Marcos is taking. And as Hans was saying, there are many ways to cut this, and this is such a big issue. and there's so many ways to look at it, and there's different ways that we can address this. So I think one question would be is how can we address this? So we thinking now just on the either the epistemic, the context level or diversity, how can we address this? There was a question on suggestions for think tanks. How can they address this? And there's one question for Ajoy as well that builds into this mega question. So what is the thoughts on an open think tank approach? So bringing in cross-section of people, so bringing in the people that we intend to help, I think that plays into giving them voices. I don't know if anyone wants to make each of you want to make one final comment, because we're about to be ending soon. And thank you.
Who wants to go first?
Yes, sorry, that was too much of a question. So main points, there's many avenues for interesting research that come from this.
Yes.
I think that's something that we can discuss in the session, in the last session today. So new ideas for research based on the commentary and what we've been thinking. And any last thoughts or comments from all of you as we're about to close this session?
Well, I think the idea of bringing in a cross-section of people is very interesting because it ties in with work on, more particularly on epistemic injustice, not talking specifically about think tanks, but really it's a way to give voice to people who are maybe not represented in think tanks because they don't have the type of expertise that think tanks need to write policy briefs or that sort of thing. But taking in directly a cross-section could maybe permit a collaboration that's more direct and really doesn't deform the message as much, maybe. So maybe that ties in a bit with what Marcos was saying with citizen think tanks, or at some point to connect there. But I think that could be an interesting avenue to explore. I don't know how it would be put into action, though. That could be really complicated.
Yeah.
If I may piggyback on that, so that for the research project, I see, like, if let's think about, we have infinite funding. So basically, we just go and say, well, we'll give funding to like a diversity of think tanks across the world or whatever. We get a sample and we give them funding to do exactly that, to bring in people. But the really big issue is not bringing in people, is really how kind of the mechanics, let's say, of this interaction between the experts, the think tankers, and the people from marginalized groups occurs. So then we could think about kind of diverse treatment, let's say, if we want to think about talk in terms of research methodology, diverse treatments, and then compare and have a metric to compare the results. And that we could be inspired perhaps by work in kind of a participatory democracy, where they've been doing stuff like that already, right? So there's a way to learn and do it then in the context of think tanks, which I think would be really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to wrap up on my end, I wanted to draw from the second comment made by Leandro on volunteers and interns and people who are on paid work for think tanks. Obviously, for think tanks, that is sometimes a very attractive option to get staff to work for them for not a lot of money, obviously, but for the, kudos for the reputation. This work that's been done by an academic called Sam Friedman in the case of the UK, called Friedman Lorison, I think were their names. They published a book a few years ago called The Class Ceiling, which was precisely on this. And I think Sam Friedman, before, he's interested in social mobility and inequality. He did research on comedy, the field of comedy, and how likely people are from working class background to make it in comedy. And obviously, he uses the metaphor of basically skydiving without a parachute. And I think the point that Leandro makes on how, obviously not everyone can afford to be a volunteer, especially a lot of think tanks are based in, expensive cities with expensive housing, etc. They're also very competitive. Even if you have, say, education from an elite university, you're still less likely to be able to accept a position such as that if you don't have the background or the resources or the support or the network of support for you to help with that sort of thing. The issue for me is that, I mean, at least at a sort of broader level, this kind of research will have to be qualitative. You can't really do it at a broader level. And it's very difficult to detect as well. But that's something interesting to look into beyond just inequality to the level of educational background, which are obviously relevant and important. But maybe beyond that, there are other things as well, such as the bank of mom and dad.
Thanks, Marcos. Yeah, just a final point from me. I think when it comes to issues of diversity and sort of engaging marginalized groups, there's often people sort of often think about, well, let's, at the individual level within the organization, let's bring in new people. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there's, let's I think the issue that you bring up, John, bringing in people from the outside and engaging them, finding out sort of what their views and perspectives are and incorporating that into your research. And I think they're both very important interventions. But I think what they miss is the bit in the middle, sort of the relational aspect within the think tank. Sort of how does structural marginalization and justice actually play out? Because I suppose all organizations, they are a reflection to some extent of the broader context. They're not sort of impervious to what's happening outside. And I suppose society is made up of the interactions of all these different organizations, networks, groups, informal, formal groups, all sort of interacting, somehow. So I think looking at sort of what's going on within the organization, having a, because a lot of the meetings that are had, during think tank, the running of a think tank is very much around a structured agenda. There's no space and time to actually discuss what's really going on between people and how's that playing out in terms of the sort of research that's being produced and the nature and the quality of the work. That kind of happens in sort of informal areas like, in the kitchen or the cafe or, on WhatsApp between individuals, but never gets brought into the sort of the spotlight, the mainstream discussions. And, marginalization just happens quietly and hiddenly. So I think my sort of suggestion would be for senior managers to have the courage to make this a priority and bring people together and start a discussion, carve out life in the sort of the life of the think tank to start talking about these issues, bring them to the surface. And once you've brought them to the surface, you can actually do something about it. If you don't talk about something, you can't think about something. So think tanks can't think about marginalization if they don't talk about it within their own boundaries.
Thank you for everybody. And I like that final point, talking about it to make it visible and to address it. So thank you, Ajoy. Thank you, Marcos. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Andréanne. And thank you, everybody who's been listening and commenting. We're now moving on to the next session. We're a bit late, but as I said, we had some time at the end. So everybody, if you can go to the sessions again, and we'll reconvene just in a different environment and with a different speaker. We can all continue the discussion. Thank you again. This has been really interesting, and I hope we can keep working together on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. And see you.